The cameras flashed as the world turned its eyes toward the Global Peace Summit in Geneva. Tension was thick in the air. Two men stood at the center of it all. On one side, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, seasoned and stern. On the other, a rising voice from the global south, Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, young, sharp, and unshaken. As Netanyahu took the stage, his tone was unapologetically commanding. If order is to be restored, then some must bow. That's the price of peace, he declared, scanning the room as if daring someone to object. His eyes stopped on Traoré. You, Africa, must remember your place. This world was built by us. There was a collective gasp. Even among the most hardened diplomats, the condescension was audible. Traoré rose slowly. He adjusted his uniform, walked to the podium, and spoke into the mic with a calm that cut like steel. I do remember our place, he said. We buried our ancestors in it while yours took their gold. The room stilled. Netanyahu narrowed his eyes, unfazed. You speak of history while I speak of now, Netanyahu said sharply. Bow down, or be isolated. Traoré leaned in, his voice lower, colder. I don't bow to tyrants, he said. And isolation? We were born in it. We survived it. You would drown in it. A stunned silence fell across the chamber. What was supposed to be a diplomatic gathering had just become a battlefront, of pride, of truth, of power. The world watched, not knowing what would come next, but knowing this, a line had just been drawn. The silence that followed Traoré's words was thunderous. Cameras in the United Nations chamber zoomed in on Netanyahu's face, which for a moment betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Traoré stood tall, not just as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as the voice of a continent tired of exploitation, tired of double standards, tired of being told who to bow to. I did not come here to please tyrants, Traoré continued, his voice firm, echoing off the marble walls. You bomb Gaza and call it defense. You call for peace while burying children beneath rubble. And now, you expect silence? No, Africa has found its voice. Netanyahu rose slowly, adjusting his tie, his expression shifting to a more controlled and diplomatic tone. Burkina Faso does not understand the complexities of our region, he said, carefully chosen words meant to condescend without sparking fury. But Traoré smiled, calm, defiant. Don't confuse our dignity with ignorance. We've seen this play before. Colonizers once said the same, that we were too simple to govern ourselves, too tribal to unite, too poor to matter. Yet here I am. And here we stand. Whispers turned into murmurs across the chamber. Representatives from Latin America, Southeast Asia, even Europe exchanged glances. Some nodded subtly. Others looked away. The balance of moral power in the room had shifted. Let me be clear, Traoré said, taking a deliberate step forward. Africa will not kneel. Not to tanks, not to sanctions, not to Western approval. And certainly not to anyone who sees justice as selective. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang. We stand with innocent lives. Whether they are buried in Rafah or cry in Ouagadougou. Whether they wear a keffiyeh or a school uniform, our pain is not a bargaining chip. The room fell into a heavy stillness. Then, a single clap rang out, from a young delegate seated in the East African bloc. Another joined. Then more. Within seconds, half the chamber was on its feet in applause. Netanyahu remained seated, his jaw set, fingers drumming the table. But Traoré didn't need to look at him again. His eyes scanned the room. The world had heard him. And more importantly, the world had listened. As the standing ovation rippled through the chamber, Traoré didn't raise his hands. He didn't smile. He stood still, shoulders squared, eyes locked ahead, as if applause was not a victory, but a signal. A signal that the tide was turning, that the silence of the past was over. Netanyahu remained seated, hands clenched in his lap. Cameras caught him leaning slightly toward his security advisor, whispering something with urgency. His diplomatic mask was beginning to slip. He hadn't expected this. Not from Burkina Faso. Not from Traoré. When the applause finally subsided, the Secretary General's voice broke the silence. We remind all delegates that today's session is intended for dialogue, not confrontation. A hollow statement. The chamber had already been changed. The temperature was no longer diplomatic. It was electric. Netanyahu stood, cleared his throat, and walked back to the podium. His words were sharp. We do not take moral lectures from those who have not fought terrorism on their own soil. We do not need approval from those who don't understand survival. Traoré raised a brow but remained silent. It was a trap. Netanyahu wanted a reaction, a misstep, but Traoré knew better. His reply would come not as a burst of emotion, but as a deliberate strike. When the Israeli Prime Minister finished, the hall was colder, stiffer. Traoré walked calmly back to the microphone. But this time, his words were not for Netanyahu. They were for the rest of the world. If terrorism is your justification, then every resistance is a threat. If self-defense means leveling cities, then every child becomes collateral. And if survival requires the silencing of every voice that dares to question you, then maybe it's not survival you're after, but dominance. He scanned the chamber. We've seen this logic before. In Africa. In Latin America. In the streets of Ferguson and the deserts of Fallujah. This logic builds empires on bones. But history shows, it never holds. This time, he didn't wait for applause. He turned from the mic, walked back to his seat, and sat down, arms folded, chin high. And in that moment, as the chamber fell into thick, uncertain silence, even Netanyahu didn't speak. The world wasn't just watching anymore. It was choosing sides. The press outside the United Nations building was in chaos. Reporters jostled for position, microphones were shoved forward, and camera flashes pulsed like lightning. Every network had cleared its schedule. The headline was already writing itself across the globe: Traoré confronts Netanyahu at the UN. Inside, however, the air was thick with unease. Delegates whispered in hushed tones. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others leaned in, curious, almost excited, like witnesses at a moment in history that felt irreversible. One African diplomat from Senegal scribbled frantically in a notebook. A South American envoy tapped her translator and muttered, This might be the speech we remember in 50 years. Meanwhile, Netanyahu leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, brow furrowed. He wasn't used to silence, not like this. Not the kind that didn't fear him. Across the hall, Traoré sat still. But inside, he was calculating. He had known this would come. Ever since the intelligence briefings months ago, Israeli contracts being signed in secret with African intermediaries, gold reserves leveraged against weapons, oil agreements buried under economic cooperation. And now? Netanyahu trying to paint a war of choice as a war of necessity. Traoré wasn't going to let Africa be the bargaining chip again. He stood once more, not because it was his turn to speak, but because silence, too, could be a form of complicity. No one asks Africa what we think, he began. They only ask what we can give. His voice was calm. Too calm. They ask for our minds, our labor, our votes at the UN. They ask us to condemn, to support, to stay quiet, depending on who is whispering in our ear that week. He turned toward Netanyahu, not directly, but clearly enough that the message was personal. You say you want peace. But peace doesn't begin when the bombing stops. It begins when the dignity of the people you bomb is restored. It begins when you sit not at the table of power, but at the table of accountability. A few delegates clapped, hesitantly. Then more joined in. Then it grew. But Netanyahu had heard enough. He rose abruptly, signaling his entourage. The cameras caught it all, his walkout, his expression, the faint, unmistakable sense of being cornered by someone the world never expected would matter. As he exited, Traoré added one final sentence. We've bowed to empires before. They all thought they were eternal. The doors closed behind Netanyahu with a dull, echoing thud. Outside the assembly, Netanyahu's departure set off a storm. News anchors gasped on live broadcasts. Commentators scrambled to find words. Analysts began to declare the moment as a diplomatic failure for Israel, and a monumental power shift in global politics. But inside the hall, Traoré didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply remained standing, not for the applause, but for the moment itself. "I didn't come here to win arguments," he said, turning back to the assembly. "I came here because my people die when men like him speak unchecked." That line struck hard. Across the room, several delegates, previously silent, began nodding. A representative from Brazil leaned into her mic and requested a special session on the humanitarian consequences of prolonged conflict. South Africa followed with support. The energy had changed. Traoré looked across the rows of flags. So many nations, so many voices, and yet so few had spoken when it mattered. We are told to wait. To be patient. To let process work itself out. But when your skies are filled with drones, when your schools are turned to dust, and when your children are buried beneath rubble, what does patience buy you then? He placed both hands on the podium. Africa has waited. Palestine has waited. Entire generations have waited while the powerful play word games. Then his tone shifted, firmer. We will not wait anymore. The silence that followed was not like the silence from earlier. This was respect. Even the U.S. ambassador, visibly uncomfortable, chose not to interrupt. Traoré's aides stood at the back of the room, watching. They hadn't prepared for this. No one had. This was supposed to be symbolic, a diplomatic gesture at best. But Traoré had turned it into something larger. A moment the world would not forget. As he stepped down from the podium, a young delegate from a small Pacific nation stopped him. "Sir," she whispered, "that was the bravest thing I've ever seen inside this room." Traoré nodded once. Not out of pride, but because he knew the cost of truth. Back in the media booths above the chamber, headlines began flashing across screens. Traoré speaks for the forgotten. African leader shakes global order. Netanyahu walks out as Africa stands up. And as Traoré exited the hall, the cameras followed. But he didn't stop to talk. He didn't need to. His words had already done what armies, sanctions, and negotiations couldn't. They made the world listen. Outside the UN building, the streets of New York were buzzing, not with the usual rush of diplomats and reporters, but with protesters waving flags, holding signs, and chanting Traoré's name. Word of the confrontation had traveled faster than any press release. The clip of Traoré's defiance had gone viral within minutes. He emerged from the glass doors flanked by aides, met not by silence or indifference, but by a crowd roaring in unity. African expatriates, pro-peace activists, students, citizens from every continent, they were all there. And for once, they weren't just protesting. They were celebrating. One sign read. One voice stood when the world stayed silent. Another. Traoré speaks. The world hears. Journalists scrambled for statements, microphones stretching like spears toward him. But Traoré didn't stop to deliver sound bites. Instead, he raised his hand, not in victory, but as a signal of calm. He turned to his aide. Set up a press conference. Not with the media, with the people. They quickly rerouted to an open-air park in Harlem, where a makeshift stage had already been prepared by local activists. Word spread, and the crowd tripled in size. Drones hovered overhead, live-streaming the event to millions across the globe. Traoré took the stage. No flags behind him. No official seal. Just truth. You watched what happened today. You saw who walked away when it was time to face justice. The crowd erupted. But let me be clear, he continued, this is not about one man walking out of a room. It's about a system that has walked out on humanity. He paused. The park fell still. They told us we were too weak. That our pain didn't matter. That the dead in Gaza, in Africa, in forgotten corners of the earth, were just numbers on a screen. But today. He raised his voice. Today, we told them, we are not numbers. We are not shadows. We are not beneath anyone's dignity. People in the crowd were crying, cheering, hugging strangers. And then he said something no one expected. This is not the end. This is a beginning. From this moment on, every silence will be met with a voice. Every injustice with resistance. And every threat, with unwavering truth. A wave of emotion swept through the park. Even the press, hardened by years of political theater, felt something shift. This wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration. And the world knew, a new kind of leadership had emerged. Design a highly detailed and cinematic background set inside the iconic United Nations General Assembly Hall during a moment of historic political tension. The main focus remains untouched on the subject's face, preserving every expression and angle, while the background transforms into a gripping scene of global power dynamics. The Grand Hall should feature its recognizable curved rows of country representatives, bathed in a dramatic interplay of soft golden and cold blue lighting from tall arched windows. The signature green marble backdrop behind the podium should appear polished and slightly reflective, catching glimmers of ambient light. In the distance, large digital screens hang above the assembly, displaying silent footage of war-torn Gaza, collapsed buildings, children in rubble, people marching in global protest. Flags of various nations hang heavily from golden rods, some slightly drooping as if weighed by the gravity of the moment. Camera drones silently hover near the ceiling, capturing the speech from every angle for a global broadcast. In the crowd, subtle details bring life. Some diplomats whisper nervously, others stare in frozen silence. Netanyahu is seated far right, half-shadowed by a structural column, his posture rigid, eyes fixated with controlled fury. Traoré stands firmly at the central podium, backlit by a faint halo of diffused sunlight. His figure casts a long shadow across the polished floor, symbolizing the reach of his defiance. Behind him, security personnel stand at ease but alert, while the press area to the left flashes with camera lights as his words echo across the chamber. Add realistic particles in the air, dust, faint light beams, and subtle reflections, to enhance the weight of this pivotal global moment. The background should intensify the scale and emotion of the confrontation, evoking the atmosphere of a political thriller climax. Ensure no facial features or outlines of the subject are altered or obscured in any way. Create a photorealistic and emotionally charged background that captures the aftermath of a heated global summit held outdoors at night in front of the UN building in New York. The main subject's face must remain completely untouched, preserving all original lighting, angle, and expression. The surrounding environment, however, transforms into a tense and cinematic moment, framed by heavy clouds rolling over a moonlit skyline. The United Nations building behind the subject is partially illuminated in cool-toned lights, deep blue and white floodlights casting long shadows. The UN logo glows faintly above the main glass facade, cracked and flickering as if reflecting global instability. Large projection screens are positioned around the plaza, replaying footage of Traoré's defiant speech juxtaposed with chaotic war footage from Gaza and rising protests worldwide. News tickers in red scroll across the bottom of the screens, showing urgent global reactions in real time. Surrounding the scene, a crowd of journalists, political aides, and bodyguards ripple with tension. Some raise smartphones to record. Others stare in disbelief. The atmosphere is tense yet historic. On the right, Trump stands behind a security cordon, his posture defensive, jaw clenched. Behind him, American flags flutter against the wind, partially obscured by rain clouds. On the left, a group of African diplomats stand tall, arms crossed in silent solidarity with Traoré. Debris from protest signs and security barricades litter the wet ground. Spotlights from nearby media vans sweep across the scene, creating stark shadows that stretch beneath the feet of every leader present. Wind stirs fallen papers across the stone plaza, echoing with the chaos of global discord. A subtle fog rises near the ground, enhancing the drama. The entire background should reflect a world at a boiling point, a symbolic battlefield of diplomacy and defiance. Ensure the subject's face remains perfectly intact and unaltered while immersing the scene in tension, history, and consequence. Transform the background into a high-stakes geopolitical confrontation at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa. The subject's face must remain completely untouched, maintain its lighting, expression, and angle without any modification. Shift only the environment around them to reflect a moment of revolutionary defiance. The scene unfolds at dusk. A fiery African sunset bleeds into the clouds, casting an orange and crimson glow over the expansive plaza. The iconic curved facade of the African Union building towers behind the subject, lined with glowing flags from every African nation. Giant screens mounted to the exterior display live translations of Traoré's fiery rebuttal, echoing through the stone plaza with subtitles in English, Arabic, and French. Security personnel in crisp dark uniforms form a perimeter around the elevated speaking platform, but their eyes are fixed not outward, but inward, toward the confrontation. Some wear expressions of quiet awe. Others appear torn between allegiance and fear. In the mid-ground, global leaders including Netanyahu and Trump appear isolated, surrounded by a small group of advisors under harsh artificial lighting. Their stance is defensive, postures closed, their expressions caught between disbelief and disdain. To the left of the subject, a crowd of African youth wave Pan-African flags. One holds a hand-painted sign reading, "Our gold, our rules." Another lifts a tablet showing footage of past colonial abuses in Africa, playing on loop. Flames from ceremonial torches flicker in the wind, illuminating their faces with a golden hue, underscoring the call for sovereignty and justice. On the right side, the press lines up with tripods and flashbulbs. Microphones from BBC, Al Jazeera, and CNN stretch toward the podium. A drone camera hovers silently above, capturing the moment for a global audience. Above, storm clouds begin to gather, signaling the tension in the air as history teeters between confrontation and transformation. Design this scene to immerse the viewer in a turning point, an atmosphere where old empires are being publicly challenged and power is shifting on the world stage. The subject's face must remain perfectly preserved, while the environment speaks of rebellion, pride, and unstoppable change. Do not alter the subject's face in any way, preserve the lighting, angle, expression, and all facial details exactly as they are. Instead, transform the background into a historic moment of defiance at the United Nations General Assembly Hall in New York City, where a lone African leader stands as the voice of a rising continent. Surround the subject with the sweeping grandeur of the UN General Assembly, tiered rows of international delegates, seated at long desks with glowing digital nameplates. The massive golden emblem of the United Nations looms on the marble wall behind the podium, casting a dignified glow under powerful overhead lighting. Use deep greens, blues, and gold tones to match the signature aesthetic of the UN chamber. To the subject's left, show Netanyahu seated at a front-row delegate table, his hands clasped tightly, his expression tense. Behind him, Israeli and U.S. advisors whisper urgently. Trump, also in attendance, leans back with a skeptical smirk, arms crossed. The atmosphere around them is stiff and closed off, filled with quiet hostility. To the subject's right, African diplomats nod subtly in support, with flags of Burkina Faso, South Africa, and Ghana clearly visible behind them. One screen projects a split view of past UN resolutions, with the word "vetoed" stamped across them in bold red, highlighting hypocrisy and inaction. The audience behind the subject is a mix of press, delegates, and youth observers. Some are standing, capturing the moment on smartphones. One delegate from a small island nation can be seen quietly clapping. Another from Latin America leans forward in awe. The tension is thick but charged with hope. Above all, portray this not as a simple political meeting, but as a moment of transformation. The subject's presence commands the room. Every detail in the background, reflections in polished wood, scattered pages of notes, ambient lighting, should speak of power shifting and the birth of new global alignments. This is not just a political backdrop. It is history in the making. Ensure every part of the environment, without touching the face, echoes a world holding its breath as one voice rises in defiance.